Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss the 1933 King Kong, starring Fay Wray, Robert Armstrong, and Bruce Cabot, directed by Miriam C. Cooper and Ernest B. I don't know if I'm going to say this right. Sack, something like that. Now, before I get into this review, I have a lot to talk about. A lot before I get into this movie. So, first of all, I'm never going to do a King Kong or Godzilla retrospective series. But I will do a mini preview on how I feel about the two King Kongs that got remade, and I'm not going to do the side King Kong movies either. The ones I mostly remember about is the Jeff the Dude Man Bridges King Kong, as well as the Peter Jackson King Kong, and I'm going to just preview my thoughts right now. I didn't like either one. Will it include my review of this one? We'll see. But here's how I'm going to do this. I'm starting with this 1933 King Kong film, leading up to Godzilla, the 1950s one, to King Kong versus Godzilla, to the Bryan Cranston Godzilla, to Kong Skull Island, and Godzilla King of the Monsters, leading up all the way to Godzilla vs. Kong, which I'm actually really excited about because it looks like a fun, pulpy entertainment kind of movie, as any King Kong and Godzilla movie are, because they're just really funny to laugh at. And will it conclude on what's going to happen in this series? No. I always thought of these movies as guilty pleasures, and I'm going to be brutally honest. I'm never going to do a Godzilla retrospective either, because that's too long for me. I mean, I've done some that are longer, but this is the longest I've heard how many movies there are in the Godzilla series. And there was one more thing. Oh yes. It was about my relationships with these movies. I always had fun with them at best. And I did see the 1998 Matthew Broderick Godzilla movie, which is a guilty pleasure at best. It's not a great movie by any means, but let's get into this King Kong Godzilla retrospective. Let's start with my review. We open with an overture, which back in the 1930s to maybe late 1970s, movies had an overture where they played the score for about 4 to 5 minutes, and this score sounded kind of frightening at first, but it got better as it went along, but it just took too long in my opinion. I just wanted to get to the movie. We get to the picture, and we see New York City in the Great Depression, which did look like a set as it was the 1930s, and even in the Bay Area, like an alleyway, which did confuse me at first. Then I realized it was the Bay Area. Carl Denham, played by Robert Armstrong, almost has a film, but his main girl star pulled out and tries to find another girl until he meets Ann Darrow, played by Fay Wray. While she's stealing an apple and treats her to a meal, and Anne, as a character, is a pretty good protagonist to follow, and Carl hires her for the picture, and Carl is a selfish son of a Seabiscuit, let's say. And the audience with Anne get on the ship, and the dialogue here is rather corny, as they're on the way to Skull Island to experience something new in the world, as nobody has ever been nor survived Skull Island. And Anne talks briefly with John Driscoll, or Jack as they call him. It got a little confusing after a while, played by Bruce Cabot, whom I get the impression is a jerky character, by the way. The actor is playing the character. The captain of the ship that's taking them to Skull Island is Engelhorn, as Carl tells him and his crew members about Kong, who's the king of Skull Island. And I'm enjoying this movie for cinematic history reasons, and I do appreciate the black and white shots in this movie, too. As they arrive at Skull Island, Carl brings Anne in as well as John and some of the crew members, and they get to land and walk around the place and meet some natives that are absolutely menacing, as their master is Kong and tries to feed him humans. Why? Because he's a giant gorilla. I do, however, enjoy the show they were pulling off before the natives tell the crew to get out of Skull Island, and they spot Anne and want to give her to Kong, but they go back to the ship as later in the day one of the natives captures Anne while on the ship, and nobody pays attention until the firelights go on from Skull Island. And John happens to be the first one to notice it, as one of the crew members spots a necklace as Anne is not on board, and they realize she's captured by the natives, and they're about to give her to Kong on the other side of the wall, excuse me. And Kong eventually arrives to get Anne and his bait as his bait, and the animatronic on Kong look kind of fake and at times a little too cartoony as the crew members arrive to rescue Anne as they open the gate to go through Skull Island, and at times have some different creature attacks on them, and which can be frightening at times as they see dinosaurs, for example. After the dinosaur fight with the crew, Kong puts Anne on a safe place where she can't escape and fights the crew members and flips a log, to get them into a line of hole. And John doesn't go down without a fight until Anne screams for her life as a T-Rex arrives, and Kong saves Anne's life by beating up the T-Rex by widely opening its jaw and bleeds it to death. And the sound design is good for its time. Kong grabs Anne and gets her back to his home. John and Carl talk of how John can sneak by and grab Anne from Kong's home, and Carl goes back to the other crew members that are still alive and tells them everything that happened to the other crew members that are dead. Meanwhile, John follows Kong to his home without being seen or noticed, as Kong puts Anne in his home as Kong is attacked by a snake, and kills it off and walks away, with Anne and John following them to the top. And I do like the way they shoot the movie as Kong's home, as you can see the skies clearly. And the creature action was good for its time. A flying dinosaur almost grabs Anne, as Kong fights it and John gets Anne out of there. As they fall into the water, the crew members with Carl wait for John and Anne as they arrive, and Carl wants Kong to be shot in his picture. And Kong does arrive and breaks through the door to find Anne and destroys he had with the natives by killing them, which does make sense because he's a giant gorilla. As Carl captures Kong and brings him on board and puts him on Broadway as the eighth wonder of the world, which is sad, but it's not as sad as the Peter Jackson one where we relate with Kong in that film, but here he's destructive at best. They're back in New York City as John and Anne go to the show on Broadway as it's sold out, and Carl introduces the audience to Kong as well as Anne and John, as the reports call it a Beauty and the Beast story, which makes sense for this movie. And the photographers, I'll say, flashes frightens Kong, and he suddenly escapes and rampages around the city and tries to find Anne as she's frightened by the turn of events. And the army comes out to stop Kong as he finds Anne with John in an apartment and grabs Anne as John tries to meet up with them on the roof. But Kong goes to many, many different roofs. Kong bumps into a train and destroys it to the ground, and goes back to the roofs, and he goes to the Empire State Building where some planes with guns try to shoot down Kong without hitting Anne. And they got lucky. Kong is shot and falls down from the Empire State Building and dies on the ground, as it is a very long way down, and John and Anne are a couple, and Carl is finished, and the climax isn't as sad as the Peter Jackson film where you can connect with Kong. But I like the way this ends more than the Peter Jackson film, as well as the 1976 film. It's just, in my opinion, this is the way to do it. Now it's time for the rating. I'll give this movie a 9.1 out of 10. I do appreciate the black and white shots throughout the movie, as at times I could see the sky, which is good cinematography. The dialogue is corny, sure, but the characters are good, as Carl could be the least good character in the movie, or in any movie in general. The animatronic of Kong did look kind of fake and cartoony at the time, but it was the 1930s. But this maybe is the best of the King Kong story out of the 1976 film and the Peter Jackson film. Because remember, I didn't like those two either. And I'll get to the King Kong versus Godzilla and Kong Skull Island on this series, as well as the new film, Godzilla vs. Kong. But I really like the film for cinematic reasons as well. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me, and next time I will be back with the original 1950s Godzilla. And until next time, let them fight.